And welcome once again to another edition of Footnotes. Pastor Mark here, and today I am excited to be joined with a real live politician. I have Dan Eubanks.
I don't know if that was an insult or a
blessing.
Or a blessing.
But Dan, thank you for being here on our podcast today. If you don't know Dan Eubanks, you need to get to know him. I was blessed to meet him about a year ago at our Capitol in Jackson, Mississippi. Dan introduced himself, and I quickly discovered this is not only a state congressional representative to the state of Mississippi, but he also is a born-again believer who is trusting Christ and making a difference in our state's capital.
Amen.
And I said, Dan, I want to get to know you. And so the Lord just brought us together, and Dan was here at our National Day of Prayer event that we held at Broadway not long ago. And I said, when am I going to get you behind the microphone and in the seat so that I can talk to you about what God is doing in politics and in government and in the state of Mississippi?
And I said, how about next week?
And I said, done. I'll see you Thursday at 11. And so here we are. And we're going to talk about some really neat things today. So thank you for coming, because in addition to Dan being a U.S. state representative with the Congress of the state of Mississippi, he is also a pastor on staff at
Advent Presbyterian Church up in, we have a campus in Arlington, Tennessee, and one in Cordova.
Okay.
And the main campus is in Cordova.
And what is your job title there?
Well, I think I've had when you're in ministry, you pretty much wind up, if you're there long enough at a church, you wind up wearing every hat at least once. I've been the interim campus pastor in Arlington for about a year and a half. Just rolled off of that. I was the youth and young adult pastor there for about 12, 13 years before I just felt God pulling me into representing him at the political level. And after I got elected, our recreation and outreach director retired, and it was a lot more conducive, being gone 3 or 4 months out of the year in that role, because I could still come home on the weekend and run basketball league and summer camps for the kids and all of that. And so I slid into that role. But in addition to that role, I've also served as the interim campus pastor. Right now, my replacement from 8 years ago, our youth pastor, has moved on to another position somewhere else, and so I'm actually filling in as the interim youth pastor and doing the other job. So I like to work, I guess.
You do all kinds of ministry.
I wind up having more jobs than my wife always getting on to me about it too.
And so, in addition to all that, you spend half of your year going down to Jackson, Mississippi, and representing all of your constituents there in Congress.
Yep.
In the state capitol.
They're in the legislature.
Yeah, legislature.
We would call it the legislature at the state level, and in Congress if you wind up going
in the national. I should know that.
It's
well,
okay.
I know
most people say that. When I knock on doors during campaign season, folks are like, "Well, how's D.C.?" And it's like, "No, ma'am, I'm down representing you at the state level in Jackson in the legislature." And so a lot of people, I've been called congressman. I'm not a congressman yet.
I see.
If the Lord opens that door, I'll walk through it. I'm a state representative.
I see. Yeah, the nuances. Well, because I know also Mississippi has a Senate. Yes. And they have state senators.
Yes.
And so kind of the assumption is congressman, senator. But, yeah, I get it. State legislator, senator. And is it the same? Well, we can get into this in a minute, but is it the same way that it is in Washington? The senators look down on the congressmen, and
they're the Lord's house. We're the common people. And sometimes the House has been known to descend into Jerry Springer-esque type of debates. Sometimes it can get pretty dysfunctional. But I always tell the pages when they come up. You'll have more fun if you're in the House, just because it does get a little crazy.
The Senate is more calm and
it's stuffy. Oh, it's the House of Lords, so they think that they are a mile ahead of us. But it's this kind of ongoing sort of ribbing that we give each other.
Well, we're so thankful that you get to do ministry and you get to represent us down in the state level. And so, what I want to talk about today is just government and the believer. I would just imagine that so many of our people who listen to this would want to ask some of these questions. So here's the 3 questions I'm going to frame this podcast around. Number 1, should we have Christians in government? Let's start there, because there are some who say it's a swamp, it's all a swamp, it's evil, and we should retreat and arc up and it's never going to get any better. Why bother? Everything's corrupt. Why bother? So let's start there. Should we have Christians in government? Secondly, I want to just talk to you about what you have seen God do using Christians in government. And we've talked about that privately, and you've told me,
Right.
look, these are things that we've been able to do, how we've been able to stand up for religious freedom. And the things you've told me is the amount of attack that comes upon the Christians who are serving is so amazing. I do not think we realize that. And you're talking on the state level. Could you imagine on the national level of the men and women who are serving as believers in that realm?
Absolutely. The swamp exists at all levels of government, from the local to the state to the only difference is the size and the depth. And so human nature is going to be the same regardless of where you're serving, and you got to prepare yourself for it. If you're a Christian, you got to know that you are going to be attacked in this world where Satan runs, rampant and tries to, take his agenda and progress it. You're going to be attacked if you are a person of faith and you are fighting for what's good and wholesome. And so, it just, the size of the attack is based on which level of government I think that you serve in.
You serve in. Thirdly, I want to just make it very personal. I mean, the Lord has allowed you and some of your colleagues to do some great things locally and statewide for Christians, for believers. And so I want to end the podcast talking about what the Lord's allowed you to accomplish through the means of legislation. So, Dan Eubanks, let's jump right into it. Should Christians be involved in government? Now, I think because you're a elected representative, I would assume your answer is yes.
You would think I was biased, and I am, but even before I was elected, I'd say yes, yes, and yes.
Okay.
You talk about, salt. If you don't have any salt in the dish is not going to be good. And we were referred to as Christians as being the salt and the light. And I know there's this misconception that most pastors and most Christians have when it comes to the debate or the discussion of separation of church and state. Everybody's heard that, separation of church and state. We don't want a government that forces you to all be a Catholic or a Church of England or whatever. And that founding fathers, that was their goal. But you do not separate the two of those things. You can't separate the two of those things. If you asked 100 people on the street, 99 of them would tell you that, the separation of church and state, that's in the Constitution, right? But it's not. And it was never the intent of our founding fathers that somehow you check your faith at the door when you go to serve and represent. And so, and as a Christian, you should never do that in any walk of life. If I worked at a gas station or a restaurant or a brokerage firm and I'm a Christian, I don't check my belief system, the foundational purpose of my being at the door when I go to work. It's who I am. It should permeate me. And so what happens is in a society where Christians step back and step out, it leaves a vacuum. And when there's a vacuum, it will always be filled. And it will be filled with people with an agenda. It'll be filled with people that have a dedication to their goal, which we see it's been rampant the last, 7 or 8 years, longer than that, but it's just really cranked up, where people that have an agenda, that have this mindset, they are dedicated to their cause. They live it, they eat, drink, sleep, breathe it, and they will rise to fill that vacuum. And so for too long, Christians have checked out of the process, seriously. And so we have, I think it was either de Tocque or Benjamin Franklin said, you don't get the government you want, you get the one you deserve. And so when we pull out, when we as Christians refuse to engage, you're going to get what you're going to get. And so I remember I was talking to you about this, I guess it was last week at the National Day of Prayer. We were talking about, I know what it was, we were talking about when Franklin Graham did a national capital tour, and I was a part of that when he came to Jackson, and it was amazing. We had 4,000 plus people show up to pray, and he encouraged folks at every stop, Christians, to run for every level of government, from dog catcher to alderman to mayor to representative to D.C. to Congress, because if we don't, It's the same thing I've been saying since I decided to run, 8 years ago. We will get what we've got, and I don't think there's any Christian out there that would look and say, wow, our government's going in a great direction. Church isn't being persecuted. The foundational Christian beliefs and moral compass that we have isn't being challenged at all. You can see it. It's real. It's happening in real time, and it's happening fast. And so absolutely, yes, Christians should be engaged. They should be involved, because if they don't, there will come a time when there's nobody there to speak for them. And that was my heart when I decided to run. I just felt this tug. And it was after the final nail in the coffin, so to speak, was when the Obergefell ruling, the gay marriage debate, when that all passed. I'm sitting in a staff meeting, and we're having to figure out how we're going to change how we allow people to use our facilities, because we can open ourselves up to lawsuits if we don't. And we're really good to the community at the church I work at. We let a lot of different groups come in and use the facility. It's kind of an outreach tool. But you can't just do that for any group. You have to be selective. But now if you have a protected class and you deny them, then somehow you've seen it. You've seen the debate. People that want to adhere to the tenets of their faith being just destroyed, whether it's a baker or a photographer or wedding venue or whatever. And I felt like I've got to do something. And I could not escape that, and it was like, okay, Lord, I'm gonna trust you in this, and I will do my best to represent you at whatever level you take me to, and that's what I've tried to do these last 8 years. And we've had some amazing stuff happen in Mississippi. I think as a result of it, I've been honored to be a part of. But yes, Christians should be engaged.
And when you decided to run, I mean, and I'm just saying this for anyone listening, maybe they would be encouraged in this podcast to say, yeah, I'm going to run for dog catcher, alderman, whatever the case may be. There was nothing like, you didn't have this special degree of political science. You weren't a lawyer. You didn't have government background. You weren't in a party already. Campaigning for some other guy or gal.
Right.
This was just you. Here you are on staff at this church, and you decided, I'm going to run. Is that correct?
That's correct. And it came with a whole host of fears and insecurities and all of the stuff that comes with that. My own father, who has supported and loved me and gone out of his way his whole life for me, said, son, what makes you think you could actually win this thing? You're not engaged politically in the county and all that. And I said, Dad, I just feel like I'm going to get out there and I'm going to work hard campaigning, and if it's God's will, it's going to happen. And I didn't know. I mean, you hear about levers being pulled and them putting the people they want in place.
Joe Kennedy.
And honestly, when you get into it and you peel the curtain back, there is a whole lot of that goes on. But you know what? That isn't the end all be all. And we serve a God that has the cattle on 1,000 hills, and if He wills it or wants you to do something, He's going to equip you and He's going to get you there. And even if it isn't, some of your members or those listening to this podcast feel called to run for office, it is your obligation, your duty as a Christian to find out what the politicians you are going to vote for believe, because you can be culpable in a crime by being a part of. If you know that if you're anti-abortion and you're very pro-life, how can you justify voting for somebody that is pro-choice or for abortion? And as Christians, we've got to dig down deep and take a look at the very people we're electing and make sure they line up with our Judeo-Christian worldview. And if we don't, then we're party to the crime. We're party to the sin, in my opinion.
Especially in the system that we have in the United States, where we are given the right to vote, we are given the right to choose, and so if we don't take advantage of that right. But I'm sure you've heard this, and I'm so curious just about your story. Two things pop in my head. I mean, one, I've heard this all my life. Well, it really doesn't matter. Nothing's going to change. And I think that is completely false. When you look at what has changed in the last decade, and a lot of it is legislation that has come down from the top, and it affects every aspect of our daily life. So for anyone to say, well, my vote doesn't matter. It's not going to change anything. Politicians are politicians. That is not true. You're right. There are people with strong agendas, and they are a driving force in the nation. But the other thing, too, that often I've heard is how corrupt the whole voting process is. Now, you mentioned the pulling of the levers. You know, the best story I ever heard on this, and I think this is pretty factual, Joe Kennedy, the father of JFK, wanted his son to win his first race so badly. What he did, he got another guy to run in the Democratic primary, okay? Mm-hmm. So this is the primary to see who's going to be the Democratic guy on the ticket. And so Joe Kennedy was so smart, he gets another guy with the initials J. Kennedy. Say that guy's name is, Jeremiah Kennedy. And he says, hey, I'll pay you. Just get on the ballot. You're not really going to win anything. I'm just going to pay you. So he puts 2 J. Kennedys on the ballot. And the people that go into the voting booth who don't like Jack anyway because they think he's rich and, from this rich family who made all their money in the stock market, but they go in the booth and there's 2 Kennedys and they're like, well, which one do I pull? And so it divided the vote, and Jack Kennedy won that first race and then ultimately would go on, to run against Nixon and then win by a narrow margin and become president of the United States. As crazy as that sounds, true story.
Oh, it happens. I mean, it's happening. Stuff like that happens even on this election cycle. Most of your listeners will know that we are about, and if you don't know, you will in the next few months when you see campaign signs on every street corner and in your neighborhood. We are a bunch of statewide elections this year, and there's all kinds of ways that politicians kind of like pick their whoever's going to follow them, right? So I can name a half dozen of them that what they'll do is they're an incumbent, they've been there forever, nobody thinks they can beat them, so they won't sign up to run against them. But they've got in mind to let somebody else, so they wait till the last day of qualification, which is like a month long. They'll pull out of the race, and then who they want will sign up, and it's too late then. It's like they just handed the seat to them. So the handoff happens all the time. But I would say to what you were saying earlier, it will become a self-fulfilling prophecy if you say, well, what is my vote going to matter? Or what's my vote going to count?
Or could I run?
Or could I even run and win?
Because they feel like the political system is so. There's another guy, I wish I could remember his name. I want to say his first name's Paul. And it's a series I watched about can a normal guy go to Washington? And this guy tries to run in St. Louis against the machine. And he doesn't win. But the rest of the story is so tragic because the machine figures out that there was one little thing they did where they sent out postcards telling people to vote for him, but it did not say this message is approved by.
Right.
And they got him on a legality on voting fraud, some kind of voting fraud. Yeah. And this guy went to prison for a year.
Jeez.
And he didn't even win. And his opponent, who was part of the same party, basically said, well, we're going to ruin you, and we're looking for anything we can do to ruin you so that you can't win against our guy. So they just had people paid by this particular campaign to look at everything this guy was sending out, look at all the mailers, look at everything, find something to get him on. Did you experience any of that? I mean, I'm asking you.
No, it happens. Usually you won't find stuff like that happening at the local level.
But your state level.
But state level, it starts happening big time. And then the higher up you go, the more it happens. Just a little caveat, all politics, they say, is local. If you run for local office, you can affect the most real-world change that people will experience. The pothole's been filled in front of my house. I've got
sure
good police
so.
and fire. Whatever it is, you see it. It's real. It's tangible. It affects people more than anything. So when you hear that comment, politics is local. It starts local, and a lot of the people that get elected local move up. When you move up, there's more at stake. When you're in the legislature, you're voting on billions of dollars worth of budget. And so there are lots of somebodies that have a vested interest in how the state spends its money. So they want their guy, whoever's going to line up with their agenda or whatever's going to benefit them the most, to win that stage left, enter the lobbyist. And they will do a deep dive on an opponent or on a candidate, and they will find anything and then go after them. So I remember I had a group that was going to help me my last go-round, and they came out and they said, well, we need you to look this over. And they dropped down this stack of paper and just plop. It's probably 70 pages, And they said, look through this and tell us if any of this isn't correct. And I'm like, what is this? And there's like, that's a deep dive on you. We don't want to be surprised by anything. Well, I'm thinking, well, there shouldn't be anything you get surprised of. A clean conscience makes a soft pillow, and I wasn't worried about it. Yeah. But I looked through it, and I was like, wow, they've got my magazine subscriptions from when I was in college 30-something years ago. There is more data out there that's available on everybody that it would probably keep you up at night if you knew how much information is accessible about every person in this country. So, that's certainly something you have to consider. It's like, well, if I've got a bunch of skeletons in my closet, if I'm going to run for higher office, I've got to be willing and ready to know that if they want to start playing dirty, they're going to pull that out. The other thing is, and they will do it, and the other thing that will happen sometimes is if they can't get you on that, all you have to do is lobby an accusation at the opponent. You can make any kind of vilest accusation. You don't even have to have proof. And they always say in politics, if you're explaining, you're losing. If you can get your opponent to say, no, I don't have an interest in, I'm not a pedophile. My opponent's a pedophile. No, I'm not a pedophile. The public sees his face, hears his voice, sees his name, and hears him using the word, I'm not a pedophile, and it taints. So there is dirtiness that happens like that all the time. And it doesn't surprise me, the story you're telling me about the guy that they get him on a technicality because they got people. And that's the problem. The higher up you go in government, the deeper the pockets, the more special interest money you got, the more you can hire staff that is their whole purpose is dedicated to figuring out how they can keep you from dethroning them. And
so we hear those stories,
and they're true,
and they're true stories.
They are true stories.
And then you're sitting here saying, "Run for office," and I'm not. I'm just pointing that out. So somebody hears this and they say, "Okay, yeah, you had me convinced at the beginning of the podcast.
Now you're scared to death.
I
was
like
no
ready
way.
to go sign up. I'm running for president. Here's my name." And then now they're listening and they're going, "Yeah, that's the dirty side of politics." And they're going to deep dive, and nobody's perfect, and they're going to make it, and like you said, accusations. Believe it or not, I was in my doctoral program with a guy who had gone to Princeton Seminary, and he had worked on a high-level political campaign, and he told me that his job, and he was an unbeliever, became a believer, and got out of that, but he said his job was to simply make up stories on the opposing candidate, and they would just send out flyers. Did you know that this candidate did this?
Right.
And I said, but they're not true stories. And he said, it didn't matter. It didn't matter. All we were paid to do was to slander the other guy so that it put the seeds of doubt in you. So that stuff goes on. So here you are, Dan Eubanks from Walls, Mississippi, and you're going to run for state legislature. You've never held any political office before. I guess my deepest question, how did you escape that? Or did you? Or did God just strike them mute like Joe Kennedy, last years of his life, he was mute in a wheelchair?
Well,
is that what happened?
I think that God does make a path. If you look throughout the Bible, you'll see where God orchestrated things, whether it was with Joseph or with Daniel or any Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. David, he orchestrated it. If you truly trust him with your life, you'll trust him with your future and the outcomes, and whatever comes will happen, and you got to be okay with it because you know that God's got your best interest at heart. So some of that may be at play, and I don't by any stretch want to discourage Christians from, I can't ever do that because I've had to declare bankruptcy or I've been divorced, whatever. No, because we live in a day and age where there's a whole lot more grace that the general public will give you because most of the general public's been divorced. A good portion has had financial difficulties in their life. So they're going to understand that. Now, if you've been pulled over 6 times with on DUIs and stuff like that, you might want to reconsider not running for something of higher office, but you could still run for alderman because that government is closest to the people. It also requires the least amount of money to run. The people you run against, they don't have that machine or the resources to go after you on that level. But I wouldn't want to discourage anybody, even if you have had sort of a conversion story, that's easy enough to portray to people. Say, I was living in the world. I wasn't saved, and I came to the Lord, and this is my life now. And look at what a great testimony the Lord has of what He can do in your life. Most people can get behind that because everybody knows that there's nobody that's perfect. It really just kind of depends on, I guess, exactly what the dirt is. But usually you don't have to even worry about that until you get up into the higher office. You run for federal office, and it's on like Donkey Kong, like the kids say. It is.
They're coming after you.
Maybe that's what we used to say. I don't even know if kids play Donkey Kong.
It's on like Donkey Kong.
It's on like Donkey Kong.
I still play Donkey Kong.
I know. We used to say that when I was growing. It's on like Donkey Kong. So I wouldn't let that discourage anybody that feels called. I mean, obviously you want to seek God's involvement in it. As a Christian, you want to make sure you're in His will. I don't want to be in Jackson or D.C. or even local government if I don't feel like it's God's will that I be there. I want to be in His will, and I think if you truly seek Him on that and seek His answer on that, He'll make it clear. He'll bring it. He did for me, and I have seen Him show up so many times that I'm 52, and if I look back 20 years ago. And I'd say, well, yeah, I trust God. When everything's going great, right? But you didn't get what you wanted, so you're kind of like, oh man, well, you're discouraged with God. But the more living that I've done, and the more I have learned to trust Him, the more I'm okay with the outcome of things, even when it's not my will, because I know that in the end, I've seen Him work it out way better in the end. So many times, it's like, all right, Lord, I'm going to trust that You got something better for me. Just waiting down the road. And I think that's true. If you feel called into politics, put it before the Lord, and if you still feel that call, go for it. Run up 110%.
Because we need good Christians.
Because we need
every level.
We need a moral compass in our government, because if we don't have one, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. It is going to be exactly what we all fear and don't want. And so we need good men and women that are Christian, that are patriotic, that believe in the Constitution and the freedoms that it enables for us to get out there and be a part of it.
So when you prayed about it and you said, okay, God wants me to do something, you didn't go local level. I mean, you went state. Was it just available? Was it like, hey, there's this position available, or
no?
Did you have?
Against, I didn't incumbent I ran against, and it was weird because I was sitting here thinking, man, I feel like I can't do anything unless I go to D.C. and fight the machine, because that's where it's all coming down from. They're poisoning the country.
Mr. Smith goes to Washington.
Exactly. Yeah. That's what. I was like, I don't have $10 million, to
and
run a race.
You have to have that money these days.
I have seen. I think if you are dedicated and willing to work hard and it's God's will, I've seen people get elected on a budget of $1,000 at a state race. I've got a good friend, good solid Christian friend of mine that serves with me in the House. He had that same pull, but he didn't have any resources, and I think he spent maybe $3,000 on his whole campaign, but he got out and knocked every door in his district, and God sent him down there. But I was back to what I was thinking why I ran for the state level. I was like, I got to do something, and I don't have the money or I wouldn't even know where to start to run for federal office. And I'm thinking, well, you know what? The state really is the last line of defense for our freedoms and liberties. If the state doesn't stand up and push back against Washington, then it's all but lost. We are a republic, and there are certain powers that are given to the states and certain powers given to the federal government. And most of the trouble comes when the federal government starts kind of usurping what should be the states' rights. And so I thought, okay, well, that makes the most sense, is I'll just run for a state office, and because I think, that's attainable, and that's something that I could really have an impact and make a change in. So,
wow. So you did it, and
So I did.
8 years you've been in the House.
I have.
In the state of Mississippi. Now, just to clarify for anyone who wonders, now, how does this work? You don't have to live in Jackson, Mississippi, our capital.
No.
In fact, you and Steve and some of those guys were telling me that you have travel trailers.
Yep.
And you all go down to the Coliseum grounds or the campgrounds?
Yeah, so there's fairgrounds right next to the Capitol building, and we are a citizen-led legislature. Most everybody's either retired or has another job, or it'd be great if you're independently wealthy and you didn't have to work, but that's one of the first hurdles, I think, for somebody that wanted to run for state level office is, well, you're not going to make enough to live off of. Trust me on that. But that means I have to have another job. And is my employer going to work with me and allow me to have that time off? Am I in a situation where I can maybe do a part-time job when I'm out of session? That's going to be probably the most difficult mental assessment and hurdle you have to jump before you ran for, say, a state office.
And just to clarify, how long are you typically in session?
So our terms are 4 years long. The first year of the term, it's 120 days, and then so basically we come in first part of January, we wrap up middle of April, towards the end of April, and then for the following 3 years, we come in the 1st of January, and we wrap up usually by the 1st of April. So you got to be down there on a Monday afternoon, usually wrap up on a Friday morning, Friday lunchtime-ish, and then you go back home. So for me, I come home, work all weekend during session, go to staff meeting at the church that I work at on Monday, leave after staff, drive to Jackson, then I'm there during the week. So it makes for a really long 3 months, but and I'm not complaining about that because I signed up to do this. But you do have to have usually another source of income, some other kind of income, because you're not going to. I guess you could if you were debt free, especially if your spouse worked maybe, but you're not going to be able to live on what you make as a state rep or a state senator.
So you go down there, you spend months, Monday through Friday.
Right.
And your church graciously says, yeah, we're going to let you go down there and do this because we think it's valuable.
Right. And I still work when I'm down there, and a lot of the guys and girls that I work with in the legislature, they've got jobs where they can manage remotely. So when you're not in session or you don't have a committee that you're supposed to be in, you'll go to your office or back to your apartment or your trailer in our case, and you're making calls, and like I'm still working on basketball league,
So while you're voting on some bill, you're over here working on a basketball schedule.
Right. And so
man, it sounds so glamorous. I mean, living in a mobile
a trailer in a parking lot,
a parking lot at a campground, a fairground, and staying down in Jackson for just months on end. This sounds great.
It's what's funny is we had it's really become a neat little community. There's about 20, 25 of us legislators, senators, and representatives that stay there in the fairgrounds. There's a couple other places some stay, and some just stay in a hotel when they're down there. But I like the sort of gypsy community feel that it becomes. You have your own place to get away from everybody else, but you still have some accountability too, because you're not going to do anything, with the other guy's trailer right next to you that he doesn't know you're doing. And there's a lot of temptations when you go down there. It hasn't been for me, praise God, but there are a lot of folks that deal with stuff that, it's whether it's alcohol or infidelity or whatever, because, you're away from your family. If you already have a proclivity for something, it's going to ramp up because every event you go to has got an open bar and it's free, And so it's nice to have people of like mind. And God's blessed me with good Christian friends and coworkers in the house that were neighbors, and in the evening we'll pull a fire pit out and sit around and decompress, But you can always say, "I'm done, going to bed, see you guys later," and just So I like it. I think it's kind of neat. Everybody else in the legislature refers to us as the Trailer Trash Caucus, but we just call it the Trailer Caucus.
The Trailer Caucus. And your wife's okay with this. She doesn't come down with you. She stays up here.
She comes down. She comes down pretty regular. She'll come down for some of the big events. And the nice thing about having the trailer is she and my son can come down and have a place to crash. And I'm not having to get all my stuff out of the hotel room on Friday morning and then recheck in on Monday. It's kind of nice. I just take my dirty clothes home on the weekend, wash them, and then bring them back. So it's she's engaged when she can be, and so is my son. He's come down and paged for me the last couple of years, and so you can still find a way to, if you're intentional, to be familial.
Yeah, but just to make that point, I mean, you guys give a lot. You don't get paid a lot.
Right.
You're doing this work, and so it's truly a calling, and it's truly a sacrifice, and it's not nearly as glamorous as people probably think.
It's not
when they think. And I would even probably say that about on the federal level. I bet congressmen. I've heard congressmen, have to rent basements and things. Now, if you're a senator, that's probably different. But if you're freshman congressman coming in on the federal level, even you're down there, you're trying to make it, and who knows? And who knows? A couple of years you might be gone, so you don't want to get anything in Washington if you live out in South Dakota.
Right.
You've got.
Well, and a lot of them, once they get tied into the whole machine, and the special interest money flows, and they can spend a lot of their, it's very defined what you can spend campaign funds on, and some of them supplement. I know some of them supplement down in Jackson. I believe some of them at the congressional level supplement. But you're right. If you're flying in on a Tuesday morning and flying home on a Friday, you're kind of like, do I want to spend, $3,000, $4,000 a month to rent an apartment, a one-bedroom apartment in D.C.? I'll just sleep in my office. I don't have any grief for anybody that's like, well, we just pull my futon out in my office and they got showers and stuff in the basement. I think that's being fiscally responsible, personally.
Yeah. Anything's possible, right?
Yeah, you never know.
All right, so God called you to do this. You've done it. You think Christians should definitely get involved. Yes. There's prices to pay, but do it. There's a good reason to do it, because we need to help guide the moral compass of our nation. Now let's go to question number 2. What have believers been able to accomplish in government? What do you see as a believer when you're particularly down in Jackson, and you've talked to me about just the spiritual darkness that is often pervading, and how people don't realize there's so many things coming against the legislators like yourself, and you're a Christian in that environment, and you've seen God use you in some particular ways. We'll talk in a minute with the third question about some things you've accomplished, but let's just talk about the spiritual battle and how Christians make a difference in that environment.
Well, I can give you 2 examples. I'll have to talk about specific legislation in order for it to make sense, but I remember my first year down there, there was a whole handful of things that I wanted to accomplish, or at least be a part of a team accomplishing when I got elected, and a couple of them I'm going to talk about right now, and they're both Christian centric, I think, and they are a good example of how Christians can have an impact. When I decided to run, you'll probably remember back 8 or 9 years ago, there were some bakers out in Colorado that they didn't want to bake a same-sex wedding cake. Even though there's 100 other bakers, you could have just gone to somebody because most people are willing to take your money. They felt the need to weaponize the government to be their enforcement arm and destroy these people. They lost their business. They ran up all this debt and legal fees. They faced all kinds of criminal charges from the state level. There have been examples all across the country, whether it's been wedding photographers or stuff like that. They're the low-hanging fruit for the people on the left that have an agenda. It's like, make an example of you so that nobody else will question. And I used to be a wedding DJ. I know I've wore a lot of hats in the years, but I have DJ'd a lot of weddings, and I had to be very careful when people would ask me, hey, they wanted to book me, and then I'd find out, well, okay, this doesn't line up with, you know what? I think I'm going to be busy. There's another guy over here. You may want to call him. Well, what was happening was you had this just persecution of people of faith. If I feel in my spirit that this is wrong for me to participate in, the Bible says that if believe in your heart that it's wrong, it'll be credited to you as sin, right? So whether it's unclean meats or whatever the situation. So these folks have a deeply held religious belief, and they're being persecuted for adhering to it. That should never be the case, especially when you consider the First Amendment of the Constitution is, the protection and freedom of exercise of religion. So we passed a bill that year, I co-authored with some other folks, that basically said, look, you have the right to adhere to the tenets of your faith without fear of persecution from the government, from it being, the enforcement arm for the people on the left that just hate anything religious. And it was core Christians that came together on that piece of legislation. I remember being shouted down on the steps of the Capitol as I was coming in by a big group of LGBTQ plus folks because they felt like it was an attack on them, when really it was the other way around. It was an attack on Christians. And so, we took a lot of abuse. I got hate mail from all over the country, a lot of it from California. And it's like, you think, well, what is this? How does this affect you? This is a Mississippi law, but believe me, they're very dedicated. And the bill came out. It had a stay put on it by the judge there locally. The ADF came and got involved in it. Anyways, this thing just kept getting appealed up. It'd die, it'd get appealed up, it'd die, appeal up. Fifth Circuit Court upheld it. It got appealed up to the U.S. Supreme Court, who upheld the Fifth Circuit Court ruling. And now that is now the law in Mississippi. You don't have to worry about being persecuted for adhering to your faith, which should be the case.
Yeah, and to make that point.
And that's because Christians came together to say, this isn't right. And even if you took the Christianity out of it, on a constitutional level, it isn't right. But it were Christians that came together and fought that fight. And because of that, now businesses and individuals that maybe moonlight and have a side hustle don't have to check their faith at the door in order to do business in our state.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think we were talking about earlier how, the Constitution says freedom of religion, not from religion.
Right.
But the idea, if I remember correctly, is not that it's the government. It's not that Christianity cannot make its way, free exercise thereof, into the government. It's that the government cannot dictate Christian belief. That was the whole purpose of it.
Right.
Because in that day they had state-sponsored churches, whether it was the Anglican Church or the Catholic Church in France. And so the whole idea coming from Europe was not that they wanted religion out of government, they wanted government out of religion.
Yes.
And that's it. And so we have every right, according to the Constitution, to have our religion in government and to exercise that religion freely. It's not just belief, it's exercise.
Right.
And people have said, well, what does it matter about these groups? Let love be love. Well, it matters when they start telling you, you will do this with your business,
yes,
or you will not do this with your business.
They will come to churches and say, you will do this as a church or you will not operate. I mean, you look at countries like Canada and places like that.
Oh, very real.
They cannot even preach certain passages of Scripture from the pulpit without it being a hate crime now. That is our future if we don't have Christians, and that's an infringement of freedom of speech and religion. And whether you're Muslim or Jewish or Mormon or whatever, you should have the right to practice under the Constitution. You should have the right and the freedom to practice your faith without
absolutely being told no.
Yeah.
Would I walk into a mosque and say, okay, I want you guys to create a pig cake for me?
Right.
No, of course not. Why? Because I know what their beliefs are. I know that's offensive to them.
Right.
If I want a pig cake, I'm not going to go to a Muslim bakery to get it. Likewise, do you want me to walk into a gay establishment and demand, make me a cake that has Leviticus on it that says it's wrong for a man to lay with another man?
And they would say, I'm not going to do that.
Okay, well, that's your freedom to do that. But you have to apply that equally.
Yes.
You can't discriminate, and you can't be intolerant when you claim tolerance.
Yes.
It's the intolerance of tolerance.
Well, it's like the old expression. It's like,
said.
I may not agree with what you say, but I'll defend to the death your right to say it.
That's right. You're right to do that.
If I shut you down because I don't like what you, well, that's hate speech, or that's racist, or that's whatever. If I shut you down and start putting qualifiers on what you can and can't say, it's going to come back on me eventually.
That's right. Eventually.
It's either you either have the freedom or you don't. And we don't get to choose. We don't get to choose one way or the other. Well, you don't get the freedom, but I do. You don't get the freedom if you do that, but I do. And so it's the same with practicing your faith. One more example, which I think all of your members and listeners will know, the Roe v. Wade being overturned. I was a co-author on that bill. People said it would never happen, couldn't happen. 50 years, 60 million dead babies later, that's just the law of the land. And I can't take credit for it. I was a cog in the wheel, but there were a lot of other people. The Supreme Court justices took all kinds of abuse, which should have never been allowed. That's a whole other discussion. But Christians came together and said, yeah, it may seem insurmountable, and maybe we just shouldn't try. It's just not going to matter. Just like maybe I shouldn't vote because it really isn't going to matter anyways. If you have that mindset, then nothing ever happens. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. But Christians came together on that topic as well and said, you know what, we're going to stand for this, whether it never lives and the law dies or not, we're still going to keep going at it. And because of that faithfulness, it's the law of the land now. It is now the state's right to regulate and choose whether or not they allow that in the state. And it's just, as Christians, we can have a huge impact. We just have to be faithful. And if you say, well, there's no way I can lead the children out of Israel, so yeah, why bother, Lord? No, you just got to be faithful to what He calls you to do. And so, yes, when Christians stand up and come together, when they are operating in God's will, amazing things can happen. And in the last 8 years, I've seen so much amazing stuff happen at the state level in Mississippi that it's like, Lord, you are good, and I trust you. You're going to make it happen. And so, but it wouldn't happen if the people that are called by His name stay out of the game. That's why we need to be a part of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And you've seen God use you guys to repel darkness in the state. Let's talk quickly about that, because you've told me, here we are Christians, and you guys have a prayer time among some of the elected officials in Mississippi. Is that right? Or a Bible study or something?
I lead a Capital Prayer Group. Senator David Parker, who represents, I think, this area here, he and I lead the group, and I've been doing that for the last, 5 or 6 years. And it's a group that meets every Tuesday morning. It's open to anybody that wants to come. If you're down in Jackson during session on a Tuesday morning, you're invited to come and be a part of it. And we come together, and we'll have a devotion and a time of prayer, and then we get on with our day. It's kind of our first morning of the week, so it's a great way to start the week. And it's full of lobbyists and government workers and senators and representatives and just people in the community that want to show up and be a part and feel called to do that. And that was part of my pull was when and if God sent me down there, He would be represented in our Capitol building. And so I think that's the way it should be for all of us as believers. He should be represented in your workplace. He should be represented in your family. He should be represented wherever He takes you. Lives get changed that way.
So there are people down in our Capitol who are praying, who are reading Scripture.
Yes.
worshiping. That's just encouraging to hear, and I hope people hear that, and I hope they pray for you guys.
Oh yes,
and they lift you up because we do have a pretty good conservative state. We have a pretty good group of legislators from this area. I can't speak, of course, for everywhere, but from this area who seem to make a positive difference.
Well, we are the buckle of the Bible Belt, really, if you think about it. And Mississippians in national polling, they're always ranked as being the most religious and the most generous. And I think those two things go hand in hand. Per capita, we give more than any other state. And that's based on what the average Mississippian makes. If you say, well, the average, 3% maybe, 5%, whatever, we are a good state. And I truly believe that God uses the weak to confound the mighty, and He is going to use Mississippi in a big and powerful. He already has. Just in my time there, we've had 2 Supreme Court ruled pieces of legislation which set the tone for the nation. God is already using Mississippi in a big way, and I'm excited about that.
You say it sets the tone for the nation. So things that happen on that level gets kicked up higher levels. And, of course, I'm not a lawyer, but I'm pretty sure we're based off British civil law, which says you look at precedents and you look at previous cases, and in this case they did this, so based on precedents. So that precedents actually helps on the bigger level.
It does. And give you an example, just a recent example, I've been very involved with a group called Mississippi Parents for Vaccine Rights. In Mississippi, we're one of like 3 states that have the most draconian vaccine laws in the country. We have no religious exemption. We have no medical exemption. We have no philosophical exemption. So if you have a child that has been vaccine injured, you're probably going to homeschool them. My son, when he was little, had an adverse reaction to his MMR shot and started seizing, and I'm riding in the ambulance to Le Bonheur, and I'm promising God everything in the world if He just helps my boy be okay. And it opened my eyes to the fact that there are people that are vaccine injured. There are people that have a religious objection to taking certain vaccines because of how they culture them on the backs of aborted fetal cells. Whatever the case is, we did not provide any kind of exemption for people. I fought for people all over the state to be able to get their kids in public school. You shouldn't become a second-class citizen just because you don't have your most recent tetanus shot. And so the group just recently, because we couldn't get anywhere for 8 years, we've been fighting this fight. So they decided to sue. Well, the Attorney General wanted them to sue in state court, but they didn't. They wanted to sue in federal court for a reason, because it sets a precedent on the federal level. There are a couple other states which don't provide religious exemptions, and people that during the COVID will remember that tried to get religious exemptions or faced losing their job if they didn't get the COVID shot. So it is about setting a precedent. And so at a state level, so like you might sue in a federal court so that it'll have a greater precedence across the nation. If it just happened in a state court, it may not make that change. But if a state does something and it goes up to the Supreme Court or it's upheld by the Fifth Circuit, it sets a precedent for everybody else. So Mississippi can lead by being a precedent for other states.
Wow, that's encouraging. So pray for your elected leaders.
Yeah.
Now let's go to the third question.
Okay.
So the last thing, I know you want to share some things that the Lord has allowed you guys to accomplish that personally affects believers in the church.
Yes.
And I think that you've already shared some really good things that have affected all of us. But let's talk specifically about some things that you've seen accomplished that you've said, this right here, you got to know about this. Because I find this to be the case. I don't know if you agree, but I feel like with politics, the art of communication is often lacking. Yeah. Like the populace doesn't really know what's going on, how it affects them. And truthfully, I mean, all you have is the media. Well, news outlets these days, newspapers, nobody's reading those anymore.
No.
So I would almost say, man, the politician of the 21st century needs to have his own podcast. He needs to have his own social media, and he needs to be like constantly promoting, hey, I want you to know this happened today. Get the news out before they do.
Oh, you are spot on. In fact, at being here in North Mississippi, we're in the Memphis bubble. you rarely ever see anything about Jackson.
Right,
Jackson
exactly.
News.
Yeah, no,
and
you
so
never do.
You're a resident of Mississippi, but you don't necessarily know what's happening at the state level. So just wanted to go over a couple things that I think your listeners and members will find very exciting. These are all pieces that I had a part in either authoring or co-authoring, and but the first one, we talk about getting rid of Roe v. Wade, and that is a amazing, wonderful, great thing, that there is value to life. But we need to also be holistic in our approach to take care of those mothers that felt like that was their only course of action, right? It's like, I don't know what else to do. I have no support network. I wind up in a situation where, and not only that, but okay, so now if you have to carry that baby to term but you don't want it, what are we going to do with that child afterwards? And as Christians, this should be questions that we should be asking ourselves, and how can we make a difference? And so last year there was a pilot program that allowed up to $3 million in tax credits, but it was only geared towards businesses. And they could take and make a donation up to half whatever their tax burden was to pregnancy resource centers and crisis pregnancy centers, and it would help fully fund them and provide a network of support for women that found themselves pregnant. And that has been expanded this year to include just you and me and the average taxpayer. And it's also been expanded to other areas like not just supporting some of the pregnancy crisis centers, but also some adoption services, some foster care, even transition homes for families that might be homeless or young women that might be homeless. And this is, in a nutshell, without getting into the nuts and bolts of it, I hope to maybe get that all published and put on my website and go around and start being the Johnny Appleseed of the tax credits. But what it will allow people to do is to give and donate up to half their tax burden until the tax credit's been maxed out. So what that looks like is, let's say you have a member, they're like, well, should I give my tithes to it? No, you keep tithing to the church. This is money you would have been given to the state of Mississippi anyways. So if your tax burden's $1,500 a year that you have to pay into the state of Mississippi, you could give $750 of that and actually choose where it goes. Now, there's a process. You would have to go and contact one of the folks that fall into the criteria and say, hey, I want to make a donation of $750, say. And then they would get approval from the Department of Revenue, and then they would give you a form that shows your donation. And then you can use that to offset your taxes the next year. So you wind up only you're paying the same amount, but you got to direct half of what you would have paid to the state anyways to a cause that you're passionate about, to a cause that is part of that, taking care of the poor and the fatherless and the, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah,
and so
absolutely.
it's an amazing thing. We also have another one that's a tax credit for food pantries. And we have one in Horn Lake that serves this whole area, and I'm sure you probably have members that are involved with that group. There was another one that was really big. It was called the REAP Act, and that was one that I was also a co-author on. And it basically what it did, it's the Regulate Experimental Adolescent Procedures. What it did was it said that you could not provide these cross-sex hormones or pre-op or transgender surgeries to anybody under the age of 18. We don't let anybody under the age of 18 enter into contracts. We don't let them get a driver's license till they're 16. We don't let them get a tattoo.
They can't serve in the military.
They can't serve in the military.
18.
You can't get married. You can't do all these things because we realize that you don't have the mental capacity to make the decisions that are far-reaching, and so we prevent that. But we were going to let somebody go down and physically mutilate and to do changes on a child that was 8 years old, and it's child abuse, and it's wrong, and it's evil, and it's straight out of the pits of hell. And
absolutely,
and so that passed, and so in Mississippi, because we had UMMC, which is state funded, it's part of the University of Mississippi, they were already doing that until a group of us found out last year out of session that they had a program, and they were doing this pre-op stuff for 13-year-olds. And we raised all kinds of and they stopped doing it, and then we codified it this session. So that's going to protect children in our state. And then maybe one of the other ones that also passed this year, it was an age verification. Folks may be familiar with it because there was a lot of hot debate about it. And it is, right now, when I was a kid, when you're riding your bike home from school, if you found a Playboy magazine or something on the side of the road, you're like, oh, wow. Right now, your 6-year-old can access stuff on Google that it would make Playboy look like a coloring book, and it is creating major issues, both psychologically and our marriages and everything, of epidemic proportions in our state. And when I was a youth pastor for almost 2 decades, and that was a problem not just for kids. It's a problem for adults. It's a problem in the church just like it is in the world, the access to pornography. And what this bill does is it forces providers, folks that put that stuff out there, to have a third-party age verification system in place. Louisiana was the first state to do it. They did it last year. And sites like OnlyFans just left the state because they'll block the IP addresses that are in that state. And so we've got to be about protecting our kids. They are the generation that's going to rule over us someday. They are the ones that are going to take over the church, someday and lead when we're gone. And so I was tickled to death that we were able to get that through. But it in the long term, I think it'll actually help even adults that maybe felt like it was completely autonomous and you could just, nobody knows, that you're going to have to think twice before you access that stuff. And it'll help Christians, I think, adhere better to their faith, because when the temptation's there and it's really easy and everybody has it in their hand, it's accessible. So those are a few of the ones that I think that just passed this session that, it's going to be good for the church.
So
but it's going to be good for society, too.
Yeah, absolutely. So these are things that you guys were able to accomplish. Mm-hmm. So when someone says, well, does my vote matter, and does it matter who's down on the state level? Absolutely. I mean, look at the level of what you've been able to accomplish. And the truth, laws are good. Yeah. They protect us. Now, sadly, in our nation, a certain group has tried to weaponize laws to punish people, but laws are meant to protect us. We have them in place in all kinds of things. We have rules in place for all kinds of good reasons. And now with all these onslaughts of technology, there needs to be these governing factors.
Some guardrails.
That protect, yes.
You wouldn't raise your kids without giving them guardrails, and in a society that has no guardrails, it's anarchy. Now, I'm always going to argue for less government. I think the more they insert themselves into your personal life, it's a problem. But at the same time, there are things and proper roles of government. And, there's a reason why we have speed limits. There's a reason why, you have ordinances in the city or in your neighborhood. You may not like them sometimes, but, when I want to go to bed at, 10 o'clock, I don't want my neighbors jamming out and lighting fireworks next door. There's a reason for curfews, but there's also it's like that fine line, that edge. You want to push back against too much government intervention, but you have to understand there is a certain need, because we don't live in a perfect world. If we did, maybe we wouldn't have to have so many laws.
Yeah, absolutely.
God gave us laws. He knew we needed guide rails.
Yeah, of course, there's always the opponents that'll try to flip that on you, and they'll say, well, if you believe in laws and regulation, then why not laws on this, and this, and gun control and everything else? Funniest thing I've heard, I heard a local alderman say this, and I stole it from him. I won't say his name because I don't know that he'd want it said, but in this whole thing with the gun debate, which is Second Amendment rights,
right?
And, people are like, we need laws that outlaw, guns and all this. And that's going to solve the problem with these school shootings and all this other sort of thing. And he said, hey, you know what we really need? let's go even further. Let's have a law that outlaws murder.
Yeah.
And then if we can
And drugs.
And drugs.
Yeah.
And if we can have a law that outlaws murder and drugs, then no one will murder and no one will do drugs because we have a law in the books that legislates it. And I thought, see, that's brilliant, because this is the logic of some of these people. They think, well, if we can just get a law in the books, everybody's going to obey it and everybody's going to do it, and that's going to solve the problem. That's not going to solve anything.
No.
Bad guys don't obey laws. They never have.
They always say that laws just keep honest people honest. If I pass a law that says, okay, you got to turn in your guns, all the honest people will be like, okay, I don't want to do it, but I will. Well, the criminals are still going to have them. So you've just basically put the honest people at a disadvantage to crime and to the criminals. The same is true with drugs. Drugs are illegal. It doesn't seem to stop anything. It's just as prevalent as. So, yeah, I mean, the reason we have the Second Amendment is to back up the First Amendment.
Yeah, right.
And you know, you take that away. You have countries like Australia and Great Britain, and the people there are saying, don't give up your guns. You know, they had to give up their guns.
Well, you know, I have a friend who now lives in Texas, and he's from Australia. And the fact that you mentioned it, he was telling me his experience, and I was blown away. He said that over there years ago, they passed the law. They never said you couldn't have guns. They just started saying you have to have permits.
Yes.
Well, then the permits were so expensive.
You can't afford it.
You couldn't afford it. And to maintain it, you had to go to a gun range every 2 weeks to keep the permit up.
Wow.
So the gun ranges brought their prices up because now it was a demand. So gun ranges went up, permits went up. It was almost impossible to keep your gun. So the only exception is they would give people who had like 40 acres or more, they would allow them farming privileges. So
a shotgun, I think is all they got. Yeah.
So he said that one day, he said, I just couldn't afford to keep the permit up, and I had a gun. He said, I gave the gun to my brother who lived on a farm out in the country. Well, he said the police would do these random, if you did have a permit, the Australian police would do random home checks where they would come into your home and they would want to see the gun. They would want to look at it. They would want to check your drawers, your personal property. Well, he said when he stopped keeping the permit up, he said 5 police officers showed up to my house and they said, you've not kept your permit up. And I said to them, well, yes, I can't afford it. So I gave the guns to my brother. Within an hour, they were out, 2 hours away at this brother's ranch, 5 police officers surrounding him saying, we're here to search your property. We want the guns that were given to you. You have to turn them into us. You do not have a legal permit to have them. And he was just telling me how literally their freedoms are being stripped away in Australia, that Christian schools in Australia are now being told if they do not adhere to the gender issue policies, that the government has the right to shut them down. So now they're being shut down. They are being forced out. And I'm thinking this is a nation that we do business with. This is a nation that our military just sold submarines to. This is a nation that we fought with in World War II and has been an ally. And it's astonishing what is happening there in Canada. They are becoming
a totalitarian
states. And so when people say, give up your guns, look, I'm sorry these things happened in Tennessee and malls in Allen, Texas. I'm very, very, that's tragic. I hate it. But the answer is not legislation. The answer is there's got to be something else. You want to find out what it is. Let's talk about really what it is. There's other answers, and the answer is not to disarm people. That may be all you have.
Well, and that's the problem. I mean, you take guns away from folks. I mean, you could lay a gun on a table for 1,000 years. It's not going to kill anybody or do anything. It is a inanimate object. It does have the potential for that, but so does a car. So does a knife. So does a hammer. And there are people. I mean, you can look at the statistics. How many people are stabbed to death in Great Britain because they don't have the lax gun laws? But if you got a knife, and so the problem is the person.
It's the morality.
It's the morality.
It's the lack of. It's the nation that is going in the pot. Nobody wants to talk about fatherless homes.
Yes.
Nobody wants to talk about the rejection of biblical truth or morality or what is right, what is wrong, absolute truth. Nobody wants to talk about that.
Right.
They want to talk about the guns. That's the problem.
And we devalue life. We have for the last 50 years. If you're old, you have no value. If you're a child in the womb, you have no value. You get to the point where you say life has no value. And if you are of that mindset and you don't have a moral compass, if you never had a father in the home, if you never, yes, we are creating an epidemic of mentally unstable individuals. And they had the shooting down in Texas, but they also had somebody drive through a group of people and kill like 7 folks, if I remember right, last week.
Absolutely, and they always will. And that's what my Australian friend was saying. He said violence has gone up 50% in Australia, even though they took the guns away.
Right.
Because now the police are battling organized crime, who has the guns, who didn't give them up, who terrorizes the neighborhoods. And I'm thinking, well, of course, you have taken away the common sense defense of these people and made them rely upon an underfunded government security force. It's always going to be underfunded. They're always going to say they're underfunded.
Right.
And they can't respond to everything immediately. There is no way. And as the morality of a culture digresses, all of this is going to get worse.
Oh, yeah.
It's just going to get worse. And, you've got to so you think about that and just how, again, we've told our children, you're animals, you evolved, you have no creator, you have no justice, there's no such thing
There's
as
really
that.
no purpose to life.
There's no be
that.
Whatever you want to be, live however you want to live.
Truth is relative.
Truth is relative. You be whatever gender makes you happy. And so we've fed this into kids. Just do whatever pleases you, and then we're amazed when they do it and they live selfishly to the nth degree, and it has repercussions on all of society. And we say, well, now what do we do?
Well, you're making my case for me. You talk about what they did to the Christian private schools in Australia. You talk about what happens when you have a society that there's not any Jesus in, and that's why we need Christians to be a part of the government. That is why we need a moral compass in this nation. And you don't get water from a dry well or blood from a turnip. And if you don't have people with a moral compass leading you and serving in government, you get a moralless society. And the outcome is predictable. I mean, you see it throughout the spans of history. What happens when you have people turn their back on God? What happens to nations that just fall into this progressive, do whatever feels right, oppress anybody that's weaker than you, life has no value? The end result is always the same. It always is the same. They say history's cyclical. We know how it's going to turn out. The question is, are you going to be a part of what staves that off, or are you going to just sit back and complain about it? And so that's why we need Christians to come and serve. They need to serve in the church, but they also need to serve in government.
Man, well, you've made a case, brother. Thank you for that. So you've convinced me. I'm going to run.
Okay, good.
What am I going to run for?
Well, first of all, you get permission from your congregation. Make sure they're good with that.
Make sure they're good.
It's just, I tell people this all the time. It's a mission field. It's just not one that we traditionally think of in the church. We think, the mission field is going down and serving at 201 Poplar, or the homeless shelter, or going to Honduras and helping folks. There's a place for that too. But the mission field can also be in government. And I think that as the church, we tend to forget that. We're usually too worried about offending members or donors or whatever. So we think, I got to be completely non-political because even if it's obvious what the answer is and where God would be on an issue, I just steer away from it. And I'm not saying all churches or that your church does it. I just know most churches, that is the way that it operates. And we've got to quit being worried about that and start looking at government as another mission field, because believe me, there'll come a day when we don't even have the power to be in mission anymore if we don't do something at the governmental level to protect our rights.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was kind of being facetious when I said, all right, I'm going to run. I'm going to run for something. What am I going to run for? But my slogan could be the little guy for the little guy. But
Yes.
that would probably be offensive to somebody.
Somebody
so
would get
now
triggered.
it would have to be the little it for the little its. So I would try to
Well,
do
no, just
that.
the fact that you said little, because people that may be gravity challenged are going to get triggered that you
Well,
even
that would be
pointed that
me.
out.
So the little guy for the little guy. That's my campaign slogan. Or little it for the little it. There we go. Because we can't use pronouns anymore.
That's right.
That's offensive.
Well, you keep on using them because we need to speak truth into this void.
Hey, absolutely. Well, Dan, thank you for joining us, and thank you for your insight. It's been so helpful, and hopefully it'll encourage other believers, other Christians to stand up to pray for you guys and to just be encouraged to know that even in the government, good things are happening.
Amen.